Hello, my name is Michael Melore. I'm an IBM cybersecurity architect. Today we're going to be talking about the security immune system and how that correlates to prevention, detection, and response. Now, we're looking at how threats have been evolving. So we see that there's been a shift that it initially started from SQL injections and watering holes being more prevalent, and we're moving more towards misconfigurations and phishing and malware. And this dashboard that we're looking at right now is information that's been collected from IBM's X-Force. We'll be talking a little bit more about the analytics and the X-Force and how you will be provided access to that. In fact, it's open to everyone as a collaborative framework. And we'll spend a little bit more time talking about how these threats are evolving, how different approaches go towards some of these different landscapes. Well, IBM conducted a CISO study, and there were some significant takeaways from that. There were really three takeaways. The takeaways that came back was that the CISOs at the forefront were really concerned about moving their security strategy and transforming that into more of a risk-based approach. And we'll elaborate more about that. The next area that really bubbled up was how can they run an effective security operations and response structure. And the third key element that was taken from that CISO study was how to effectively execute information and risk and protection. So those particular areas, well, let's focus more on, in fact, IBM actually constructed their organization towards those three key elements. And we've bundled a number of different solutions into those different categories. So let's first start talking about the security transformation and moving away from a compliance-based approach and moving towards a risk-based approach. And a compliance-based approach was more or less checking off the boxes that organizations had, the various controls in place. But it really didn't measure the effectiveness of these controls. So that's why these organizations know now that it's not just about having those controls, but having that risk-based approach to really see where they're missing the mark. So we start out in that approach with identifying the risks for the organization. And then you map that and correlate that to the various controls that the organization has at their fingertips. So some of those controls may have come from industry controls, or they may have come from industry-based controls, or maybe controls for the organization, maybe product-specific controls. Then looking at those controls according to risks and determining where the gaps may exist. Then, after identifying the various gaps, to really prioritize which of those gaps should be addressed and closed initially, and then which ones maybe are the lowest priorities, and then attacking those, coming up with a plan to execute on that. And then in executing those, the remediation of those gaps, pretty much comes down to three different approaches, and it could be collective as well. In fact, in most cases it is collective. But the integrated solutions would be where the organization provides all of these different control points and then integrates them into some type of a holistic approach, or just has different siloed approaches and uses that into their security posture. They would also maybe leverage managed security services, augmenting some of their resources with external talent to facilitate closing those gaps. And then to start looking at solutions that maybe not so integrated, but maybe just off-premises solutions based on software as a service. Again, most of the solutions actually incorporate all of those different components in how to close those gaps. Well, let's talk about an attack. So when attack comes in, we all know that it's not just about the intruder just gaining access into the facility. It's about what they do after that compromise. And it's really about exploiting the different areas throughout the infrastructure. And that entails touching a lot of different components within the infrastructure. Certainly protected data, the different maybe devices, pretty much the exploiting and the integrity of the data, the confidentiality of the data, and the access of the data. So if you were able to have different control points at all of those different layers, that would allow you to detect where maybe something was undetected initially in one of the components, but as these intruders traversed to different components throughout the infrastructure, there's a good chance that that one of the other control points would pick up and detect, and maybe even isolate and initiate some type of a response based on that. Well, the fundamental component for any effective security posture typically starts from log collection. And we have old information on the screen just so you could see. This was kind of the older model that the SIMS, that's the Security Incident and Event Management, to correlate the different event logs from all of the different endpoints and systems and applications, normalize that information into a centralized repository, and then to use tools on a forensic basis to interrogate those events, to try to identify something that may have happened, and then to take the step to let's not have that same thing happen again. This is what was a result of that. This is how the people got in. This is the situation. Let's put the controls at this particular point so that this will not happen again. So it was a forensic type model after the fact. Well, and I use the term of older information because this was the older approach. Well, it's evolved. There are many organizations that are still in this forensic mode, but the next generation of this practice is really to do things more real time by analyzing patterns of behavior. So, and that would be evaluating maybe sessions and traffic, and then trying to determine anomalies that these traffic patterns and flows are inconsistent. And we're seeing a shift in this particular area, and this could maybe alert us to some type of a behavior that's going on, and then maybe even incorporate some type of control that might even be automated that can maybe quarantine some of this traffic based on that, or block that traffic. So that's where the old log consolidation is moving towards, or has moved to, in a number of solutions out in the marketplace. Now to take that further, because it's not just about the traffic, it's now to start bringing in a view of the content, to bring it up to, in the OSI stack, the application layer, bring it in So we could even see the type of applications and the content that's being exchanged, and then look at patterns of behavior even on the content to maybe even see if the content is traversing to an inappropriate area that is inconsistent. To actually even look at maybe encrypted content and to assess that type of content. And we might even be talking about some type of social media or content, or some things that are maybe prohibited or allowed, or maybe you have a choice, a policy of maybe allowing social media like Facebook or so to be used maybe during lunchtime and maybe blocked at other times. So those are the kind of things that allow you to start looking at things from a contextual point of view. And until now, we're probably talking about policies that are defined in the organization, and rules that you're defining. But it doesn't have to be things that you define, because there's actually avenues to bring in external information and intelligence into these. So it's not just about defining the rules and the patterns, but maybe to correlate these traffic flows and the content patterns with maybe some intelligence that you can leverage. We're talking about X-Force and so forth. We'll spend a little bit more time about these intelligent collaborative communities that provide information to particular systems seamlessly. But now to take that even further and bring in cognitive aspects. So machine learning, interpretive aspects, where we can look at maybe blended threats that are across maybe flows and content and behavioral patterns that are not consistent with a particular flow, and letting the cognitive aspects, like such as Watson for cybersecurity, I'm referring to take that into light, shed light on this, to say this looks like this particular threat that you're being faced, and even bringing in some approaches to remediation at the same time that it's identifying some things, maybe automatic quarantining even aspects. This is where the model is evolving. Well, we talked about the logs and the importance of these logs as being the keystone to any security posture. We'll refer to that as security analytics and tooling. And what we'll do, so this is that normalization and the consolidation of these event logs and maybe the intelligence and so forth. And then taking that information and providing that to your first level responders. These are the folks that are called upon because something is suspected, and they're first on the scene trying to assess if it truly is some particular incident, to then triage that incident to determine if it's something within their means to remediate, or whether they need some additional assistance, whether they need to communicate that to other parties. And what they will do is they will look at the tools that they have available to them to help diagnose that situation. Some of those tools may arrive from the security analytics tooling, some of your own assets, or they may be from internet searches to try to see if anyone else has come up with the same type of a situation. Or they may escalate it to their level 2 and level 3 analysts. So those level 2 and level 3 analysts, while they're second and third level support to the first responders, there are probably less of these individuals that are available to the organization, and they have some other roles as well. So part of their roles typically, besides responding and providing second and third level support to the first level responders, is to try to compile reusable assets and store them into maybe some type of a threat database, and then they could share that with the security analytics and tooling. And this is a cyclic model where now these assets are being compiled and then provided to the level 1 responders so that there's less frequency of depending on the level 2, less escalations to the level 2, level 3 analysts, the more assets that is able to be generated. The problem in this particular model is that most organizations are probably still stuck in the older model of just collecting and normalizing the log information, using it in a forensic mode after the fact. Not yet to an intelligence framework where they're including flows, content, cognitive aspects. The next challenge is that the security analysts are using the tools that they have at their hands. So for the most part, they're probably just looking at forensic information. If they're fortunate enough to have maybe some more intelligence, great. What they're also doing is they're leveraging maybe internet searches. So they're looking at searchable, indexed and searchable content that's out in the internet. The resources that you have available to you on the level 1 and level 2, level 3 are probably stretched pretty thin. Those level 3 analysts, while they're trying to respond to everything they can with the level 1 analysts, they're probably stretched thin to even create the reusable assets, the reusable content on how an approach was taken. So we're going to be looking at more in the future in incorporating more cognitive capabilities in there, and we'll talk more about that. So those level 2, 3 analysts that are generating content just don't have the time to really populate that data, and anything that they can is probably minimal. But if they're able to do that, that's a step in the right direction, because then they're less relied on the next time that the same type of a situation comes up, because there's reusable methods on how that threat was remediated the last time. So regarding the information that's accessible from the internet, traditionally there's only about 20% of security threat information and remediation steps are indexed and searchable via search engines. So where is the extra 80% that's not seen? Well, that 80% that's not seen is in the deep web, we consider that. That deep web would be in social media, textbooks, in maybe some forums that might be throughout the internet, wiki pages, wikis, unstructured data. It could be videos. This information is not indexed. There's no keywords, there's no indexes, it's not searchable by traditional search engines. This information can actually be identified through cognitive capabilities. So this is where Watson for cybersecurity could tap into this type of information, and it's actually doing that in other aspects of Watson for non-cybersecurity. If you were fortunate enough to maybe see the CBS 60 Minutes show on IBM Watson, you may have seen some really interesting facts where it's helping in healthcare and so forth, where Watson's actually interpreting so many different papers and clinical papers and so forth, and and deciphering all of these different papers and consolidating the information for the healthcare practitioner so that they could see maybe some difficult cases, maybe looking at DNA and so forth. Interpretive, that's what we're talking about, cognitive aspects. So when you could bring that 80% of untapped security and intelligence information and provide that at the fingertips of your first level, second level, and third level responders, well, that's an effective approach. So it really brings in the aspects of bringing human aspects into the cognitive capabilities and tying in all of the different analytics and controls, and then feeding that into your control points that can actually maybe even act on that on behalf of your resources that are already stretched. To provide immediate information as a threat is being faced, to present not only that there's a threat that's being presented, but here's the likely threat source, here's the remediation steps that have been used to get that, and arm your responders with all of that information at their fingertips. Next, we'll talk about the information risk and protection. So your infrastructure pretty much breaks down to, I'd say, these 5 different categories. Your network infrastructure, your application infrastructure, your data infrastructure, your user community, and then your fraud aspects. And the fraud. So let's start out with the network vulnerability. So we start out with firewalls so that we could maybe protect and block some particular traffic segment information that is external versus the internal framework, your trusted sources of information and what should be exchanged internally and what shouldn't be filtered externally, and so forth. Well, it's evolved further than firewalls, and now we bring in intrusion detection aspects and intrusion prevention aspects, and also bringing in vulnerability management all into the same framework at the network perspective. Next, we have application scanning. In many cases, organizations are already evolving towards policies that all new applications must be scanned before they go live. We're seeing that even in the government. To identify and close those vulnerabilities before you expose yourself to them. And then the next one is the data classification and data files activity monitoring. To identify critical files, critical systems in the organizations, systems that maybe should be protected more than others, try to maintain that least privilege management model, and to actually monitor the activity of those files and where they're going, who has access to them, so forth. Well, then it takes us into the user access management and access controls. So that would be your onboarding, your offboarding of users and applications, the governance, the recertification processes that all of us have to do to maintain a least privilege model. So to try to determine, to provide the tool sets for the managers to periodically review if their users have the appropriate access, if there's any separation of duties or segregation of duty type violations in the organizations, how you're adhering to compliance and regulatory requirements, how you're sharing that access among users, among different organizations, and even managing the privileged identities of the users and the privileged access to your critical systems and applications. And then the third control covers maybe the behavior patterns of some of your applications, maybe your web applications, determining where there may be fraud based on different behavioral anomalies, bringing in the mobile fraud capabilities as well. So all of those particular controls that we just discussed, you may have particular control points at each of these different components. But it makes sense to start tying all of those control points into a centralized intelligence and analytics framework, the next generation from the old SIMs, basically. So that way you could have some kind of common approaches to all of this. What we call this is our security immune system. You may be familiar with the term defense in depth as well, where you're putting control points at all of the different key areas throughout your infrastructure. For this particular conversation, we're focusing primarily around the incident response and operations. So we're talking mostly about, from this point of view, the threat intelligence and the security analytics. And then bringing in the network aspects, the patching, the endpoint capabilities, and we'll also be touching on some of the newer threats that are bubbling up around cloud security. But it really takes an immune system that covers all of the different components within the enterprise and consolidating that into a single security posture. What we've identified is that the attacks are getting more and more sophisticated. We're seeing probably about 5 new attacks on a daily basis. And these attacks are constantly changing, and your infrastructure is constantly changing. There's so many products out in the market, so many vendors, so much integration that the organizations are taking on themselves, keeping them from really doing what they should be doing, which is servicing the lines of business, because now they're placed into the integration business. And then, by the way, the types of incidents that we're seeing, the majority of exploits that we're seeing are based on vulnerabilities that have been defined and recognized for between 1 year and 2 years. And now there's probably reasons for that. And that could change at any time. But what we're seeing now is that most of the attacks are not really pointed at new vulnerabilities surfacing. So one reason may be because there's a number of different actors in the dark web that actually kind of have different roles. So the first people maybe are the folks that are just identifying vulnerabilities. And some of them may even have views that they're actually helping to strengthen the security framework because they've identified these vulnerabilities and they're posting that for the world to know, so that way the organizations could actually remediate those vulnerabilities. Maybe not. I don't, or maybe they're just painting that for the other bad guys to now start defining tools. And that's what some of those actors do in the dark web, is that they will start automating tools to exploit those vulnerabilities. And then once those tools are made, those tools might be then disseminated to the different hackers. And there's different levels of hackers. There's even the novice ones, that some of these tools have been constructed so simply that even a novice hacker could just download some type of an exploit kit and point that to a particular organization and launch without even knowing anything really about how that vulnerability took place, what that tool is actually doing. These are novice hackers that just point and click and create havoc. And now the organizations are also faced with resource constraint. Our information indicates that there's about 200,000 vacant security opportunities today. That number is projected to increase to 1.4 million between 2018 and 2020. Now, there may be a number of reasons why those positions are not filled, and they may be budgetary, or they may be resources that there's not enough skill sets for that. There's also a lot of different control points throughout the organization that would have to be staffed if it was to effectively execute that security posture that is intended for those organizations. So, what do you do to keep pace with the escalating attacks, the increasing complexity, and the limited resources that you have? You're going to be forced to look at things differently than you have in the past. You're going to be forced to leverage some of those strategies that we talked up front to augment some of your security capabilities with managed security services. You're going to be forced to look at organizations and vendors that have provided integrated solutions rather than you doing all of the integration efforts. You're going to be looking at ways to automate some of the responses and some of the quarantining and the prevention and the detection and the alerts and the orchestration of response. This is the new model. You'll be doing things more off premises as well. You'll have no choice. The amount of resources that would be required moving forward would be a luxury that few organizations will have the luxury to have. So it really will come down to a new way of thinking for organizations that will rely on more intelligence and cognitive aspects, will get out of the integration business and rely on others to facilitate the integration, bring in more holistic pictures, and to rely more on automation wherever they can. So let's go over the endpoint aspects. So all of the organizations have a tremendous number of endpoints. It's difficult to control based on all the different applications and systems and operating systems and so forth. Even discovering all of the different endpoints, let alone patching or discovering vulnerabilities, is a task in itself. So to bring in some type of a framework that can discover all of the different systems, can actually evaluate the vulnerabilities on those systems, can assist you in even providing malware protection and antivirus protection and continuously monitoring those endpoints for malware and bad behavior. And then to take those vulnerabilities after discovering them, where maybe in an automated fashion, to even incorporate the patching by scheduling. It identifies the vulnerability on this particular system, and it can schedule maybe on a weekend, after hours, and so forth, the patching of that vulnerability to close that down. Again, we talked about most of the exploits are based on vulnerabilities that have been in existence between 1 year and 2 years. So even if you're patching, and if you miss a couple of systems, those things are exposed, and these automated threats that are that you're facing are taking advantage of those. And then to bring that into some type of an automated incident response framework, and tie in compliance. That would be the next step. Then now we'll talk about the network capabilities. Again, we talked about earlier about the firewalls, the older firewalls, and just protecting and blocking was just not enough. It really takes intrusion detection and intrusion protection to actually start assisting in your framework to identify behavioral anomalies, to inspect content, to actually feed that intelligence into your intelligence and analytics framework, so that way you could have intelligent approaches based on some incidents or some blended threats that you're facing, and to feed that all into your security immune system. And in this particular case, a tool such as IBM's QRadar, that is the next generation of the old day SIMs, of the log collection, but the next generation, which incorporates vulnerability management, threat protection, incident forensics, compliance aspects, user behavioral analytics, and even brings visibility to what's going on in the cloud, off premises, mobile devices as well. To tie that all into your common dashboard, where you don't have the resources to put at every choke point, but maybe you could provide a single framework dashboard console to different actors throughout the organization to assist them, so you could identify blended threats. And then to identify when those incidents occur, and to execute the response process immediately upon finding the incident or being faced with the incident. So let me tell you a little bit about IBM. So a while back, IBM averaged about 20 days per incident in remediation. 20 days to remediate. And we brought in a framework called Resilient. And what Resilient provided IBM in orchestrating the response and executing the response, IBM went down from 20 days to under 5 days on an average response. So this was so effective for IBM that IBM acquired Resilient and baked that into their IBM Security Immune System that we're using and is available for customers as well. And what this provides is a way to orchestrate responses. It includes workflow, notifications, even simulations. Well, government, military, and exercises, first responders are simulating responses to disasters and incidents. I'll ask you to think about how well you're simulating responses to different security threats throughout your organization that can be disastrous for your organization. How effective are those simulations that you're doing? Those orchestrations? How long does it even take for you to get the right people in front of a particular incident? And that audience may change and shift to different actors based on the type of incident that you're being faced with. I know myself, when I was one of those early responders to incidents throughout my career, I know that in many cases just responding to the senior management asking for an ETA on when the situation was going to be remediated was constantly keeping me away from the incident at hand. I remember saying to myself, if they just gave me a little bit more time to focus on this thing instead of answering the phone and giving everybody an update periodically, I could be further along in remediation of this incident. So to bring a framework in that actually takes the information, presents you with, this is the threat at hand. By the way, here's what we believe it is. And by the way, here's the remediation steps that are associated with this type of an incident. Here are all of the people that should have been notified or automatically have been notified, maybe even in some type of a workflow, automatically, and that you've already simulated and orchestrated that you could even test that response without even an incident, so that you have exercises in your organization based on this with the workflow engaged as well. To take that information as it's being done to allow actors within your organization to see what's going on with the progress of that remediation, instead of bothering the first responders or the responders that are working on that, to actually could see in real time where they are at any given stage of this response, to include a repository of the different assets that are being used to remediate the situation, that then become your assets in your threat repository for those first level responders. All of that collection of information that your level 2, level 3 resources never had the time to build is now being collected in this same incident, and that is now reusable as an asset to be used the next time this incident surfaces. Everything is at the fingertips of these first responders. This is an effective approach. And now let's talk about the fastest growing security category. This is the cloud access security. It's the area that organizations have the least amount of visibility into. They have maybe policies that dictate that maybe some frameworks should not be used. But can they actually determine whether or not those policies are active or effective or not? There's so many new file sharing facilities that pop up on a daily basis. I'd say it's near impossible for organizations to define and blacklist different file sharing capabilities to block, with new ones surfacing every day. Then we have the security elements of that and how to effectively disseminate that information. Well, the users themselves may not be that savvy in understanding the differences between the different file sharing aspects, but they may, let's use an example of Box. Maybe the organization has a strategy that they have a relationship with Box, and it's protected, and that's the policy to use Box. But maybe the users are using Dropbox at home. Well, Box and Dropbox sound an awful lot alike, and I could probably rattle off lots of different file sharing systems that are out in the cloud that also sound or have the same similar names to one another. So to put that onus on the end users to maybe distinguish the different cloud facilities that are supported or prohibited in the organization. So to bake that into your threat analytics, into your intrusion protection framework, into your content analysis, So you could determine what content is leaving your organization, how it's being shared. That's the effective approach. Now, also tying that into IBM's X-Force. We started out this presentation showing you some information intelligence based on X-Force. That was a particular dashboard that is available to IBM, and that will be available to everyone. But even the dashboard that you're looking at right now, when you come into X-Force, and this is open to everyone, even our competitors are leveraging this. It's open to all the good guys to start collaborating the same way that the dark web folks are all collaborating with all the bad stuff and how to attack organizations. We're collaborating all of the threat intelligence, and we're allowing and exchanging information. And you could be just an observer of this type of information. You could be a contributor. We're getting all types of contributions from all different sources into this knowledge base that we're allowing people access near real-time information as it's transpiring. We can see the threats that are going on throughout the world. We can constrain that, different states. We could look at even particular threats or even IP addresses. So maybe let's say that you have the old-fashioned state of just correlating logs and then taking that information in a forensic mode. Well, now you're in forensic mode. Maybe you're seeing some type of an IP address that seems to be an anomaly, and you could bop that right in here, and it'll tell you where that IP address came from, what threats it may have been associated with in the past. Maybe at one point it's been used for some spam, maybe it's been used for some malware, and it's giving you all types of intelligence around that particular IP address. All valuable information. And now I'll show you some of the dashboards that are coming to this that we at IBM have access to, that actually disseminate even this X-Force information even more so. So we're looking at right now a view of the world. And in this view of the world, we have a breakdown of the different threats that we're facing. And I'm looking at a particular window of time between May 13th and September 13th. And between this particular window, this is the threat landscape that the world was faced with, and we could take that information. We could look at the pie chart even on the bottom or the bubbles, and see that there's a large amount of malware that's out in the world at that particular time, and how the breakdown is. And this might even help you to try to figure out where you're going to put some of your resources in your organization. But you know, it even gets more valuable because we could start constraining this in different views. So let's just take a view of the United States. So when we take a look at the United States for that same period of time, we can see the breakdown. Again, the malware is very prevalent. We see a high occurrence of phishing as well, and we see some that's non-disclosed as well. And then let's take this down to a couple of industries, and we could see how the threat landscape and the incident landscape has shifted between different industries. So the first one we go for is the government. And, we see from the pie chart and the bubbles that we're seeing a high incidence of brute force. Really wasn't too much on the radar in some of the other industries we're going to see. Malware, pretty prevalent. Misconfigurations and how those were exploited, and denial of service. Let's now take a look at healthcare. So from healthcare, we could take that down, and we could see that in healthcare, well, we're not really seeing the brute force attacks in healthcare, but what we're seeing is misconfigurations, and certainly the malware is still pretty prevalent around healthcare as well. Let's now take that to education, and we could see that the threat landscape certainly changed for education as well. We're seeing a high incidence of phishing. We're seeing malware misconfigurations being the big areas around education vertical. So these types of tools might help you in budget aspects and trying to figure out where you want to invest your resources. But again, tying this all in, feeding this information into your threat intelligence, which we do. This is actually a big part of our QRadar offering. It's a module that brings in X-Force. To bring that all into your security posture is just an effective approach. And now we were talking about Watson earlier in cognitive aspects. So right now, this X-Force is actually part of the teaching of Watson for cybersecurity as well. But it's a two-way street. We're starting to get Watson also engaged into this. But right now, we're collecting a lot of this information from IBM's managed services, from communities, from contributors, the thousands of IBMers that are actually participating into this information, feeding this. And this is only getting better with the cognitive aspects as well. Well, with that, I'd like to thank you for your time, and I hope this was valuable. That we discussed IBM's approach to a security immune system. You may also refer to this as defense in depth. Thank you, and have a great day.